Right. Ready to dive into some pretty heavy philosophical waters today.
Always up for a challenge.
Excellent. Me too. So we're going to be talking about G.E. Moore's moral philosophy, and we're basing this deep dive on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry.
Okay, sounds good.
Now, given that you have, pretty solid background in philosophy, I don't think we need to spend too much time on, like, the philosophy 101 stuff. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah, no need to rehash the basics.
Exactly. So think of this as, like, us pulling out the most interesting, maybe even controversial bits of Moore's thought for you.
Sounds fascinating. I'm all ears.
Perfect. Let's do it. So Moore, he's a fascinating figure to the history of ethics, someone whose ideas continue to spark debate, even today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's start with his idea of non-naturalism, which is like, the core of his whole ethical system.
Okay.
He was super adamant that moral judgments, like, they're objectively true.
Right.
And that ethics has its own kind of autonomy, meaning it can't be reduced to just, like, scientific or metaphysical facts.
Yeah, no reducing ethics to just atoms in the void, right?
Exactly. So how did he get to this idea of non-naturalism?
Well, one of the main tools he used was this thing called the open question argument, which was basically aimed at naturalism, which, as you know,
Of course.
tries to equate good with some natural property, like pleasure, for example.
Right.
So Moore, he used this very simple statement, pleasure is good.
Okay.
And on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But Moore argued that it's not a tautology, like saying pleasure is pleasure.
Right. So pleasure is good is saying something more than just pleasure is pleasure.
Exactly. That little word good, it adds something entirely different, something that natural properties just can't capture.
That's a really interesting point. I've always found that argument pretty convincing.
Yeah, it's very elegant, isn't it?
It is. It's very elegant because even if we say that, pleasure is the only thing that is good, it still feels different to say, like, pleasure is good than to just say pleasure is pleasure. Like, good is doing something else in that sentence.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head.
But of course, an argument like that, it's going to generate some pushback.
Oh, absolutely. Tons of debate over the years.
What were some of the main objections to the open question argument?
Well, there's the paradox of analysis objection,
Right.
which basically suggests that if you try to define good well enough, you're always going to end up with something that sounds like a tautology,
Okay.
simply because you're trying to capture, like, the very essence of the concept. But then there's the response that says, well, maybe that doesn't actually apply to good, because it still feels like there's something more to good than can be contained in any definition.
Like, it resists being fully defined.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about this distinction between the concept of good and the property of goodness? Could those be different in a way that, undermines Moore's argument?
I see what you're getting at.
It's kind of like, how water and H2O refer to the same thing, but we understand them differently.
That's a really interesting analogy that definitely makes you think.
Yeah.
But when we apply it to good and goodness, it seems like the analogy breaks down a little.
In what way?
Well, the water H2O case works because water has very specific empirical properties, right, that let us make this kind of identity claim.
Okay.
But goodness, on the other hand, that's not about, like, discovering some kind of underlying physical structure or composition.
Right, because a whole different category.
Exactly.
So Moore's view of good as simple and undefinable that could actually hold up against this kind of objection.
It seems that way, yeah.
Very interesting. So Moore really pushed the boundaries of how we think about good and ought. What were some of his key, like, metaethical innovations?
Well, one of the big debates at the time was about which concept is more fundamental,
Okay.
good or ought.
Right.
Sidgwick, he put ought at the center of things.
Mm-hmm.
And he defined good in terms of what we ought to desire.
Okay.
But Moore, he initially flipped that.
He flipped it.
Yeah, he defined ought in terms of what produces the most good.
So it's like, which one comes first, the good or the ought?
Exactly. But later on, and this is really crucial,
Okay.
he actually acknowledged that ought is its own distinct moral property. But he still maintained that good is the simpler and more fundamental concept.
Okay, so they're interconnected but not reducible to each other.
Precisely. It's a subtle but important distinction for understanding how his ethical system works.
Very interesting. Now, another key innovation was this focus on intrinsic value.
Yes, absolutely.
More, he argued that a state of affairs, its intrinsic value, depends only on its intrinsic properties.
Right, not on any kind of external relation.
And this is where his famous method of isolation comes in, right?
Yeah.
This thought experiment where you imagine a universe containing only that state of affairs, and you ask, would it still be good? Even a complete isolation.
Yeah, you strip away all the context, all the external factors.
Right, to focus on the thing itself.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a really radical departure from earlier thinkers.
It was a game changer.
Because they often tied value to things like usefulness or pleasure.
Right, good for something else or good because it feels good.
But more, he's saying, no, there's something about certain things that are just good in and of themselves.
Precisely.
And this method of isolation, even if you disagree with his conclusions, it forces you to really think about what makes something truly valuable.
Yeah, no matter what your position is, you have to grapple with that thought experiment.
Now, of course, Moore's non-naturalism, it's faced a lot of criticism over the years.
Oh yeah, a lot of pushback.
Some people accused him of, bringing in unnecessary metaphysical baggage.
Right, like he's making things more complicated than they need to be.
Yeah, with all this talk of non-natural properties and intuition.
As if he's creating this whole other realm of, mysterious moral entities.
Exactly. But if we actually look at what Moore himself said, it's clear he wasn't proposing some kind of, elaborate otherworldly realm for these properties to exist in.
Right, he wasn't building a whole new metaphysics from scratch.
Yeah, he even explicitly denied the existence of a, quote, supersensible reality. And he even compared goodness to numbers.
Oh, interesting.
Saying that they have being, but they don't actually exist in a tangible way.
That's a clever way to put it.
So he's actually advocating for a more grounded view of non-naturalism.
Yeah, less about grand metaphysical systems, more about the distinct nature of ethical truths.
And his epistemology was also pretty grounded,
In what way?
Well, he used the term intuitive
Right.
to describe our knowledge of moral truths, but he wasn't suggesting some kind of mystical faculty or anything like that.
Oh, secret sauce, right.
Right, he just meant non-inferential knowledge.
Okay.
The kind of direct grasp we have of certain basic truths.
We just see it, we don't need a chain of reasoning to get there.
Exactly, and he even acknowledged that our moral intuitions can be fallible.
Oh, so he wasn't saying our intuitions are always right.
Right, we can be mistaken about what we perceive to be good.
That's a crucial point.
So both in his metaphysics and epistemology, Moore was surprisingly modest.
Yeah, I see that.
Closer to figures like Sidgwick than a lot of his critics might realize.
He's often painted as this radical metaphysician, but he was really just trying to highlight the unique nature of moral truths and how we come to know them.
That's a great way to summarize it, and this emphasis on simplicity and reductionism. It was also evident in how he thought about normative concepts.
Okay, how so?
He believed that we only need, two concepts, good and ought.
To express all of our moral judgments.
Exactly, pre-minimalist, right?
That's pretty radical, especially compared to contemporary ethics where we have so many different concepts, like well-being and all these different types of ought.
Yeah, we've definitely expanded the vocabulary of moral philosophy since Moore's time.
We have, but you can understand why Moore and his contemporaries took that approach.
Because they were trying to, lay the groundwork.
Exactly. They were figuring out what the basic building blocks are, the foundational concepts.
Right, and once they had that foundation, they could start asking the big questions.
The really juicy stuff, like what is good and what is right.
Which brings us to Moore's own, often controversial answers to those questions.
Yeah, oh, buckle up. It's about to get interesting.
Okay, so Moore embraced this idea called impersonal consequentialism.
Oh, right.
The idea that the right action is always the one that produces the greatest total good, impartially considered.
So no playing favorites, just maximize the good no matter who benefits.
Right, and initially, Moore saw this principle as, analytically true, stemming from his very definition of right.
Okay.
But as we talked about, his views on ought evolved over time.
Right, he started to see things a bit differently.
Leading him to accept consequentialism as a synthetic principle.
Okay, so not just derived from the meaning of terms, but a substantive claim about how we should act.
Precisely. But even then, he didn't really feel the need to, extensively argue for consequentialism.
Really?
He considered it kind of self-evident.
Interesting.
Which, to be fair, wasn't unusual for his time.
Right, consequentialism was pretty popular back then.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, Moore only really considered absolute deontology as, like, the alternative.
Okay.
He didn't really engage with the idea of moderate deontology, where rules might have exceptions.
That's fascinating. Makes you wonder how he would have addressed that more nuanced view of rules.
Definitely something to think about. And along similar lines, Moore's views on impartialism, initially he saw that as a direct consequence of his definition of good.
Right, so if good is objective and universal, then it can't be good for one person and not good for another.
Exactly. And he argued against ethical egoism,
Mm-hmm.
claiming that it's incoherent to say something is good for one person but not for another.
Okay.
But he later kind of softened his stance on that,
He did?
admitting that while he still believed egoism was false,
Yeah.
he couldn't, like, conclusively prove it.
So he left some wiggle room there.
Right. It's like he was implicitly acknowledging that maybe there could be different ways of defining good
Possibly, yeah.
that could allow for different kinds of ought, you know?
Oh, including those focused on individual good.
Yeah, but maybe we're reading too much into it,
Maybe, maybe not. But it shows that his thinking was constantly evolving.
which makes him even more fascinating to study.
Absolutely. Even with his strong convictions, he was always open to revising his ideas.
It's part of what makes his work so compelling, even today.
I agree.
Now, let's move on to the second big pillar of Moore's moral philosophy, the one that sparks so much discussion and, honestly, a bit of head-scratching.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
It's his idea of ideal consequentialism.
Okay.
And at the heart of it is this belief that what's truly good goes beyond just pleasure or fulfilling desires.
Okay.
Moore argued for the inherent value of certain states of being.
Regardless of our attitudes toward them.
Exactly. And this is where his famous, and some might say infamous, claim comes in.
The one about the most valuable things in life.
Exactly.
Keep me with it.
He said that the most valuable things in life are aesthetic, appreciation, and personal love.
Wow. Okay, that's a bold statement.
A very bold statement.
I'm ready to dive in, but maybe we should save that for part 2.
Yeah, you're right. That's a whole other can of worms.
It is. We'll unpack all of that next time.
Sounds good. Let's leave our listeners with that little cliffhanger.
We'll be back soon to explore the world of beauty and love, more style.
Can't wait.
Welcome back. Glad you could join us again as we continue to unpack Moore's moral philosophy.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive back in. We left off with that rather provocative claim, that the most valuable things in life are aesthetic, appreciation, and personal love.
Oh, yeah, that one definitely raised some eyebrows, especially coming from a philosopher who's known for, his super rigorous analytical approach.
Right. It's not exactly what you'd expect from someone who's all about logic and careful argumentation.
But I think, especially for those of us with a philosophical background, we can really appreciate the depth and the kind of complexity behind Moore's thinking.
Totally. He wasn't just trying to be shocking or anything.
Yeah.
He was really trying to get at something fundamental about the nature of value.
Absolutely. His views on beauty and love, they were, deeply connected to his whole ethical system.
And if we remember, he wasn't a big fan of pleasure. He saw it as a pretty minor good.
Yeah, almost negligible, really, in the grand scheme of things.
And that really shaped his vision of what a good life looks like.
Right. It's not about chasing fleeting pleasures, but about cultivating certain states of consciousness.
Okay, so for Moore, aesthetic appreciation, that wasn't just passively taking in beauty.
No, not at all.
It was a more active and engaged state.
Exactly. It's about understanding, perceiving, and appreciating beauty.
So it's I'm looking at a beautiful painting. It's not just about the colors and shapes hitting my eyeballs.
Right.
It's about me actively engaging with the beauty, recognizing its qualities,
And feeling a sense of admiration or even joy as a response to that beauty.
It's almost like a more intellectualized kind of appreciation.
Yeah, it involves both our minds and emotions working together.
And interestingly, he didn't think the creation of beauty held any, separate intrinsic value.
That's right.
It was all about the appreciation.
The value was in the experience, not in the object itself.
Which kind of goes against, how much we emphasize artistic creation.
It does, but Moore's argument was that even artists, when they're creating beauty, they're still engaging in a form of appreciation.
Because they have to understand and appreciate the beauty they're trying to bring into the world.
Exactly. It's like they're appreciating it internally even before it exists externally.
So even beauty, in a sense, is grounded in this fundamental concept of good.
Right. It all circles back to his reductionism.
Right. Yeah, I see that. Beauty gets its value from the good it generates through our appreciation of it.
Exactly. And if we remember back to his definition of beauty, he actually defined it in terms of goodness.
Oh, right.
He said that beauty is, quote, that of which the admiring contemplation is good in itself.
So it's like the contemplation of beauty is what's inherently good.
Precisely. But it's important to note that More's views on beauty, they weren't like static.
Okay.
He shifted his thinking a bit over time.
In what way?
Well, initially, in Principia Ethica, he argued that beauty is good in itself.
Right.
But later on, he kind of suggested that its intrinsic value might be pretty minimal.
Like maybe not even good at all on its own.
Yeah, potentially. But he always maintained that the existence of beauty adds a lot of value.
So even if beauty itself isn't inherently good, having it in the world makes things better.
Exactly. It's like a value multiplier.
I like that analogy, like it takes the good and amplifies it.
Exactly. And it really highlights how important context is and the way different elements interact to create value.
And this leads nicely into his principle of organic unities.
Yeah, the idea that the value of a whole isn't just the sum of its parts.
Right, the way things are combined, how they relate to each other,
Yeah.
that can add to or detract from the overall value.
Yeah.
So how would this apply to, like, his view of beauty? Can you give me an example?
Sure. So imagine someone contemplating a beautiful landscape, right?
Okay.
If they're just imagining it, the experience has some value.
Right.
But if they're actually there, experiencing the landscape firsthand, the value is even higher,
Right.
even beyond the value of the landscape itself.
So it's the combination, the unity of the experience, and the real existing beauty.
That creates this additional value.
It's like the whole becomes greater than just the sum of its parts.
Exactly. And More used this principle to critique Sidgwick's argument for hedonism.
Okay, how so?
Well, Sidgwick claimed that a world without consciousness, and therefore without pleasure, would be totally devoid of value. And from that, he concluded that pleasure must be the only good.
Right. If there's no pleasure, there's no good.
But More, with his perspective on beauty, would have totally rejected that premise.
Right. A beautiful world, even without minds to appreciate it, would still have value.
Exactly. But he went even further.
He did.
He suggested that even if we accept Sidgwick's premise,
Okay.
his conclusion doesn't necessarily follow.
Interesting. So even if we grant that a world without consciousness has no value,
Right.
it doesn't mean that pleasure is the only source of value.
Right. Pleasure might be a necessary condition for value.
Okay.
But other things, like awareness of beauty, could also contribute to the value once pleasure is there.
So it's not that pleasure is irrelevant.
No.
It's just that it's not the whole story.
Exactly. There's more to the good life than just pleasure.
And it's worth noting that this principle of organic unities, it wasn't totally unique to More,
Right. Other philosophers had explored similar ideas.
like the idealists.
Yeah. Thinkers like Bradley.
But they had a much more metaphysical approach.
Right. They saw the parts dissolving into the whole.
It's all about the absolute, the ultimate unity.
Right. But he kept his more analytical approach.
You're still trying to, like, break things down, understand the individual element.
Exactly. He believed we could still distinguish the parts, understand their contributions to the overall value.
And this led him to his holistic formulation of the principle.
This is where things get really interesting, especially for those of us who like to, really get into the nitty-gritty of philosophical concepts.
I'm ready. Break it down for me.
So basically, it says that when parts come together to form a whole, their individual values, they don't change.
Okay.
Any extra value that comes from their combination that's attributed to the whole itself as a separate entity.
So it's like if you have a bunch of ingredients for a cake, each ingredient has its own nutritional value.
Right.
But when you put them all together, you get a cake.
Yeah.
And the cake has a deliciousness that goes beyond just the sum of its parts.
That's a perfect analogy. I love it.
Right. The whole becomes something greater than just the sum of its parts.
Exactly. There's a synergy that creates a new level of value.
And More use this holistic formulation in other areas too, like when talking about desert and punishment.
Oh, yeah. He had some interesting things to say about that.
Right. He believed that while vice is bad
Mm-hmm.
and suffering is bad,
Right.
the combination of the two, in cases of deserved punishment,
Yeah.
could actually be good as a whole.
So it's like the punishment, even though it involves suffering, can contribute to a greater good.
Exactly, because it's connected to the vice, to the wrongdoing.
It's a very nuanced way of looking at punishment.
It is. It acknowledges the badness of both the vice and the suffering.
But it also recognizes that something good can emerge from their conjunction.
Right. It's not a simple equation of good and bad.
No, it's about understanding the context, the relationships.
And how those relationships can create new levels of value.
Exactly, and this is where Moore's holistic view really shines.
It allows for that complexity, for the possibility that things that are typically bad can actually contribute to a greater good.
Precisely. It challenges us to look beyond the immediate, the surface level.
And to consider the broader picture, how different elements interact and create value in unexpected ways.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Moore's other chief good, personal love.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting, at least for me.
It's a fascinating and often misunderstood part of his philosophy.
So for more personal love, it wasn't just about, like, feeling warm and fuzzy towards someone.
No, it was much more than that.
It was about appreciating the good in another person.
Right, recognizing and valuing their intrinsic goodness.
And for him, this meant focusing on their mental states, their capacity for good thoughts and actions.
It's a love that's grounded in a deep appreciation for the other person's moral core.
So it's not about their looks or their personality.
It's about who they are at their very essence.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to his overall view of value.
Right, it all fits together.
And this is where he introduces those, what did he call them, recursive principles.
Yeah, that's right.
To generate higher level goods and evils from a basic set. I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more about these recursive principles.
So the first principle says that if something is intrinsically good,
Okay.
then loving that thing for itself is also intrinsically good.
So if someone loves beauty, then loving their love of beauty is another good, and so on.
Exactly. It creates this, chain of ever-expanding goodness.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. Each link in the chain adds to the overall goodness.
And he has similar principles for hating evil, loving good, and hating evil.
That's right. So any attitude that's appropriate to its object
Like loving the good or hating the evil.
is itself good, and any inappropriate attitude is evil.
So it's not just about the objects of our attitudes.
No,
It's about the attitudes themselves.
precisely.
Our emotional responses, our moral sentiments, those have value too.
Exactly. It's not just about what we value, but how we value it.
And these recursive principles weren't entirely unique to Moore.
Right. Other philosophers like Rashdall and Ross also explored similar ideas.
But they framed these higher level values as virtues and vices.
Yeah, whereas Moore saw virtues more instrumentally.
Right, like virtues are good because they lead to good outcomes.
Exactly. Not necessarily good in and of themselves.
And he also differed from them in how he viewed the relative value of these higher level goods.
Right. So Rashdall and Ross, they thought virtue was the greatest good and vice the greatest evil.
Hmm.
But Moore thought their value was often less than the value of their objects.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So let's say someone feels compassion for another person's suffering.
Okay.
That compassion is good, but for Moore, it wouldn't be as good as the suffering itself is bad.
So it's like a moral calculus. You're weighing the relative values.
Exactly. Trying to figure out where the balance lies.
That's pretty counterintuitive.
It is, but it reflects his commitment to this balanced view of good and evil.
He didn't want a system where vice and suffering were somehow necessary to create the highest goods.
Right. Like you need the bad to appreciate the good.
Exactly. It's a really fascinating way of thinking about it.
It is. It challenges a lot of traditional assumptions about morality.
Okay, so how do these recursive principles apply to his specific account of personal love?
Well, as we discussed, it's a love focused on admiring the good qualities of another person.
Right, especially their mental qualities.
But when he applies those recursive principles, it results in a somewhat limited picture of love.
You mean beyond the focus on contemplation?
Right. So it's not just about appreciating the good in another.
Okay.
It's also about not actively engaging with them or promoting their good.
So even in love, action isn't seen as inherently valuable.
It seems not. It's all about the internal state of appreciation.
Recognition of the good, that's where the real worth lies.
And this extended even to his view of love of physical beauty.
Okay, so even there, it's about admiration from afar.
Right, not about physical intimacy or erotic desire.
That's quite a departure from how we typically think about love today.
It is. It's a very different perspective.
And what about physical attraction? Did he have anything to say about that?
Well, he actually viewed sexual arousal as a form of love for the ugly or evil,
Oh, wow.
and therefore as evil itself.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it definitely goes against how we usually think about sexuality.
Right. Like, that's not exactly a view that would be embraced by many today.
And it doesn't stop there. His list of the goods to be appreciated in a loved one, that was pretty limited too.
Okay, so it wasn't enough to just be a good person.
Well, he excluded things like pleasure, happiness, even knowledge or achievement.
He did.
He mainly focused on the other person's appreciation of beauty.
So the ideal loved one, according to Moore, is someone who's really good at appreciating beauty.
That seems to be the case.
It does seem a bit, I don't know, one-dimensional.
It does, and to make things even more complicated, his insistence on impartialism in value
Right, this idea that everyone's good counts equally.
meant that his account lacked that special attachment, that heightened concern for an individual that we usually associate with love.
So if I love someone for their good qualities, and then I meet someone else who has those qualities to an even greater degree,
Right.
Moore's theory would say I should switch my affections.
That's a tough one to swallow.
It is. It doesn't really capture the depth and complexity of real love.
No, it doesn't, but some people argue that a more kind of robust and fulfilling account of love could still be built within his basic framework.
Okay, I'm curious. How would you do that?
Well, you could try incorporating a wider range of attitudes and goods.
Right, not just focus on appreciation of beauty.
And you could also develop a more nuanced view of individual value that allows for special attachments and heightened concern.
So it's like his specific formulation of personal love was maybe too narrow,
Possibly, yeah.
but the core ideas, like love as a response to intrinsic goodness, those still hold potential.
I think so too. There's definitely room for further exploration there.
Welcome back to our final exploration of G. Moore. You know, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from metaethics to the good life. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And revisiting Moore's work, it's been a real intellectual treat, especially, with your expertise to guide us.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure diving into these ideas with you. Moore's philosophy, even when you disagree with it, always sparks new questions.
That's so true. It challenges you to think differently.
Absolutely. And while we've touched on the main themes, there are always, layers to uncover, nuances to explore.
Oh, absolutely. We could probably spend hours unpacking the criticisms of his non-naturalism.
Oh, easily. There's a huge history of debate there.
Right, especially those objections to the very existence of non-natural properties.
Yeah, some philosophers argued that appealing to those kinds of properties is totally unnecessary.
Right, even harmful to ethical discourse.
Exactly. They proposed alternatives like, emotivism or prescriptivism.
Trying to find a different way to make sense of moral language.
Right. How do we talk about morality if it's not grounded in something objective?
But those alternative theories, they didn't completely wipe out Moore's non-naturalism.
No, they didn't.
In fact, there's been a bit of a revival of non-naturalist realism lately.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely having a moment.
Philosophers are finding new ways to defend it.
Adding more and more layers to the debate.
It's amazing how these ideas keep evolving.
Moore may have started the conversation, but it's far from over.
It's like he set the stage, and now everyone's building on what he started.
And still wrestling with those fundamental questions about moral truth.
It shows how influential his work really was. He wasn't just offering a set of doctrines.
Right, like take it or leave it.
It was more like he provided a framework, a method.
A way of thinking about these really tough questions.
Like his famous open question argument.
A classic.
Even with all the different interpretations and critiques, it's still a powerful tool.
For sure, it challenges any attempt to reduce morality to something else.
It forces us to grapple with the idea that moral concepts, like good and right.
They have this unique nature that can't be explained away.
Exactly. And even if we don't agree with his specific answers, his commitment to rigorous analysis, that's something we can all learn from.
Absolutely. No matter what area of philosophy you're working in, that kind of clarity is essential.
Okay, speaking of specific answers, I want to touch on his claims about the good.
Okay, the controversial stuff.
Especially his focus on aesthetic appreciation and personal love.
The ones that cause the most head-scratching.
Right. I mean, those claims, they seem a bit out of touch.
Yeah, especially for people who don't have easy access to beauty or the opportunity to cultivate those deep relationships.
They're like, is that really all there is to the good life?
Right. Is that a complete picture?
Maybe Moore's formulation was a little too narrow.
Yeah, maybe he was focused on an ideal that's not attainable for everyone.
But the underlying idea that some states of consciousness are valuable in themselves.
Not just for what they lead to.
That's still a really powerful insight.
It is. It challenges us to move beyond a purely utilitarian way of thinking.
To see that certain experiences and relationships have value just because of what they are.
Exactly. And it leads to a final thought-provoking question.
Okay, I'm listening.
If we accept that states like aesthetic appreciation and love have that kind of intrinsic value,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean for us today in a world that's so different from Moore's?
In a world dominated by technology.
Yeah, where our experiences are mediated by screens.
And our relationships can feel so fleeting. It's like, what happens to Moore's ideals in a world like ours?
That's the million-dollar question.
What does beauty even mean in a digital age?
Right, and how do we form deep connections when we're constantly bombarded with information?
And pulled in a million different directions.
This whole new set of challenges
Like
and
Moore has given us this puzzle.
these timeless ideals that we have to figure out how to apply in a totally new context.
Exactly. And I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive.
It has been a fascinating journey.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us as we explored the world of G.E. Moore.
His ideas, they continue to challenge us, even today,
And we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for his work.
and left you with some food for thought.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.